This is All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. A new book offers a look at minstrelsy in America. It's titled Darkology, Blackface and the American Way of Entertainment. Blackface is an ugly chapter in American history, but that chapter is not as far in the past as some may think. Since the mid-1800s and well through the 1970s, these performances were everywhere, performed by professionals and amateurs across the country, in all kinds of institutions, schools and churches, at political fundraisers and fraternal organizations, in wartime performances meant to boost morale, even in Japanese American internment camps. After the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal, they were actually funded by the federal government. What's hard to grasp is just how much of this history has been obscured. Records of posters or how-to guides were lost, destroyed, or never formally archived. A lot of what survives has been tucked away in shoeboxes and attics and basements. Even the Library of Congress took measures to hide these records from public view. The historian Raylan Barnes' new book, Darkology, pieces that history back together. She spent about 2 decades tracking down these materials and reconstructing a past that has been largely hidden from view. Barnes is an assistant professor of American cultural history at Princeton, and she's with us now to unpack all of it. Raylan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
I wanted to do some definitions of terms before we have this conversation. When we say blackface and minstrelsies, what exactly do we mean?
Yes, so blackface is essentially a costume technique where an actor would use burnt cork or later on oil paint to darken their faces in a racially stereotypical way to make fun of Black America on stage. But it dates back to Shakespearean times. Minstrelsy tends to talk about the use of blackface on stage in three-part minstrel performances or minstrel shows that were an interesting mix of stand-up comedy, tap dance, banjo fiddling, that really became emblematic of American culture by the 1830s.
What do people tend to misunderstand or perhaps oversimplify when they hear those terms today?
I think blackface is often used to discuss controversial or racially offensive Halloween costumes. And so, obviously, that's something that we continue to grapple with in American culture, especially on college campuses, where there might be, for example, a hip hop Halloween party. But what this book is really looking at is organized, mass commercialized, very, very lucrative local shows that were the dominant entertainment form in the 19th century and then in the 20th century in the era named Jim Crow,
Hmm.
which is literally named after the number one and first blackface minstrel character, that these were shows that illuminated and ignited entire communities that were then reinvested directly into supporting an unequal Jim Crow segregated society.
I would love for you to read your author's note at the beginning of this book because I think it's kind of extraordinary. Would you mind reading that?
Of course, I'd love to. Author's note. Darkology is a cultural history of white supremacy and amateur blackface minstrelsy in America during the 1800s and 1900s. It contains offensive historical language and visual culture. Historical sources are preserved in their original form to illustrate the unadulterated content Americans and people who encountered Americans worldwide engaged with, memorized, performed, watched, collected, and protested for over a century. In the 20 years since I began researching Darkology, America has changed inexorably. Views on historical language and imagery in the classroom continually shift. Views on using historical language and imagery have often been battlefronts in America's culture wars. This is partly why amateur minstrelsy's history has remained unstudied. I eschew censorship and the sanitization of history, advocating for candid conversations about America's complex past. Students, irrespective of age, should engage with the enduring legacy of Blackface forthrightly and unflinchingly. I aim to transform history courses for students who will transform the course of history. The history of Blackface is grotesque. It hurt, and existentially so, to research and author this book. It will likely hurt existentially as well to read it. But awe-inspiring heroes also radiate power and beauty. I intend to show how white supremacists constructed, circulated, marketed, and handed down stereotypes intergenerationally to empower Americans with the truth of how anti-Black stereotypes became ubiquitous. This knowledge is a tool to negate minstrelsy's power and weight on America's soul.
Raylan, why was it important to include that note?
I think right now we're in an era when we rightfully so want to protect people from unintentionally encountering very disturbing imagery and language. Blackface is a cultural hate crime that dominated American entertainment for a century. And so teachers and historians go to great lengths right now to make sure that we don't do undue harm. But at the same time, part of the reason that we don't know this history is the result of the incredible, overwhelming success of a civil rights movement to get these images, this language, and this music out of our American federal government and education system. But the pendulum swung so widely that it became so censored that even the act of teaching this means you could lose your job. Showing these primary sources, they were incredibly censored. And so I wanted Americans to understand that I was not going to hold back, that I would aim to properly contextualize everything as much as I could, because exactly what I said, I want Americans to have the tools to dismantle stereotypes. Once you realize how they're constructed and made, you also know how to take them apart. And that's what I wanted to help impart to the American public.
We're speaking with historian Raylan Barnes. Her new book, Darkology, Blackface and the American Way of Entertainment. She presents groundbreaking archival material to present a fuller history of blackface in minstrelsy in the U.S. So you worked on this project for 20 decades, and finding material was, 20 years. 20 decades, my goodness, 20 years.
I look good for my age.
You ran up against walls. You ran up against, we don't have, that isn't in our archive. Tell us about your experience researching this book.
Absolutely. So the major reason that it took so long was exactly these obstacles. So the National Archives and the Library of Congress, for example, are the people's archives. They are meant to preserve our American story. But when I would go to the Library of Congress and a lot of local archives, especially historical societies, especially during the Barack Obama administration, when he was in his sort of early political ascent, I could go days and I would only get responses that a book was missing on the shelf, missing on the shelf. And I was spending so much money. DC is a very expensive place for a graduate student to go and conduct research. And I discovered that what was going on is that a lot of different curators and librarians and archivists felt that this imagery was so taboo, so combustible, that even the act of an expert looking at it could have unintended consequences. And some of those are a response to the rise of white supremacy in our own lifetime. The proliferation of things like Xerox machines and the internet meant that white supremacists and organizations like the Klan could unfortunately try to reanimate this, what was once an American craze and pastime. And so, part of what I had to do was say, okay, I can't do this research in the traditional way, but what I can do is go across the country and try and meet Americans where they are. And for example, during the housing crisis, when an enormous amount of Americans were downsizing, they would find in their basements, their attics, their piano benches, evidence of their parents and their grandparents' participation in this cultural form, whether it was as a director, a song choir, a leader, or even as a child in Jim Crow America, who was forced to do this as part of the education system. And I have gone to great lengths to accept donations of these materials and preserve them so that I could not only write this book, but hopefully open the door for other researchers to continue and understand this complex American history.
This is interesting. We got a text from somebody who said, "My uncle had a role for a player piano, so you could have
Yes.
your own home minstrel show. It came with a booklet with jokes and speeches from the different characters," which is quite interesting because you talk about in the book Tin Pan Alley. Everybody
Yes.
knows about Tin Pan Alley in New York, where New York City publishers and songwriters, they dominated popular music in the late 19th and 20th century. But you write that Tin Pan Alley has an association with minstrelsy. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Absolutely. So the player pianos are a perfect example of how multimedia this was. And in fact, even though it is a very old-fashioned and backwards looking art form, in that the jokes and the play plots and the song lyrics are all about really trying to argue for the benevolent, or so they argued, aspects of American slavery instead of racial terror. But it was presented in always cutting edge technology, whether that was multimedia player pianos, the beginning of Tin Pan Alley, which was the mass distribution of sheet music, the beginning of American film and television. And you're right that this is an essential New York story. A lot of people incorrectly assume that blackface minstrelsy was a creation of the American South. It is the opposite. It starts in the Bowery in the Five Points in the 1830s, and as Broadway begins to take hold as a staple of American entertainment, and then the birth of Tin Pan Alley and the explosion of songwriting and America as a sort of cultural tastemaker for the English-speaking world. New York City is actually where the bulk of the characters are created and sort of radiate out from New York City to places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, London, and then also throughout the British Empire, where unfortunately a lot of these racial stereotypes translate.
Yeah, to your book points directly at the North. You point to Paterson, New Jersey in 1903, just right across the bridge, the Darktown Brigade. This is a really interesting story. Tell us about the event and how it struck you as revealing the broader picture around blackface.
Yeah, so at the turn of the 20th century, there was a series of race riots in New York City and New Jersey. But when I use that term, you have to sort of deconstruct or delete the imagery of what we have become accustomed to seeing on the television.
Mm.
Race riots for most of the 19th century and most of the 20th century meant white vigilantes going into black neighborhoods and causing racial terror, engaging in lynchings, arson, etc. And so at the turn of the 20th century, which is also when we get the birth of Jim Crow as an institutionalized legal regime, we have a mass wave of these forms of racial terror. And in Paterson, New Jersey, one night in 1903, it was a hot summer night. There was a parade going on, and people were in a restaurant enjoying the evening when all of a sudden there was smoke filling this restaurant, and the people began to panic. And as this fire began to consume the restaurant, all of a sudden, a group of what they believed were black men burst into the room with axes and pikes and water hoses to fight the fire. But instead of letting the firefighters fight the fire, the white patrons began physically attacking the black firefighters, believing that they were perhaps a part of retaliation in this moment of race riots. But as they continue to use their hoses to put out the fire, there are descriptions of watching their flesh, quote, melt away. And what they soon realize is, in fact, this is not a black firefighting segregated troop at all. This is a group of elderly white retired firemen who had been performing in the parade as an amateur how to blackface troupe who saw the fire catch hold from fireworks and rushed in. And the response of the white patrons is really fascinating because there's two ways to interpret it. Either they were so indoctrinated by these racist blackface stereotypes that they couldn't tell men in comical face paint from reality, or the other alternative is everyone was in on the joke and started playing up their minstrel parts as the public
Hmm.
in their response. And so Darktown brigades were sort of this interesting subgenre of blackface, especially in New York and Pennsylvania, where there would essentially be mock um, uh, arson fires of what was called Darktown, which starts with Currier and Ives. It's a mock black district. So in New York City, it would be Harlem. And people dressed in blackface would pretend being saved from the wreckage. And thousands of Americans would actually show up for these incredibly bizarre reenactments of racial violence.
We're talking about the new book, Darkology, Blackface and the American Way of Entertainment. My guest is historian Raylan Barnes. We'll have more after a quick break. This is all of it. You're listening to All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. We're speaking with historian Raylan Barnes. Her new book, Darkology, Blackface and the American Way of Entertainment. She presents groundbreaking archival material to present a fuller history of blackface and minstrelsy in the U.S. One of the big revelations from this book, Raylan, is about amateur minstrelsy. We often think about it on stage, but the idea that people used it in their daily lives. What did amateur blackface look like?
Absolutely. So, yes, what we typically think of about blackface is both the massive, large-scale stage shows in the 1830s through the American Civil War, and then, of course, iterations like Al Jolson and the Jazz Singer, Bing Crosby in something like Holiday Inn. But what my book really focuses in on is that after the American Civil War, these celebrities who were the most famous, not just New Yorkers, but also famous around the world, begin to publish these how-to step-by-step minstrel guides. So what happens is Americans go from being passive consumers who are watching these shows to then becoming men, women, and children who are learning how to paint themselves into racially stereotypical ways that they interpret it as funny. How do you walk funny like a black person? How do you talk funny like a black person? What kind of vocal register would you use? And these performances were normally held on public property in K through 12 schools. Local fraternal orders would typically
Hmm.
be involved, politicians. And what's really critical here is when we are living in the height of segregation and sundown towns, you would find towns and cities across America where they perhaps do not have Black Americans who live there. They perhaps serve there or work there. And you have children who are watching their local judges, their local police force, their firefighters, their teachers tell them that this is emblematic of American life, Black music. Black dance, what slavery was. As we know, slavery was not, in fact, playing banjos all day.
Mm.
But I think when we have this continued legacy where, for example, we have a president who says slavery wasn't that bad, when you understand the context that 1 million shows a night were happening in the United States in these government federally funded spaces, presenting to America that this is in fact what slavery was, you begin to understand the depths of how this shapes our own understanding of our American past and why we need to actually try to understand what really happened.
You also document how during the New Deal, the federal government supported cultural programs. You describe this as kind of a blackface bureau. How was blackface framed as part of a, quote, national recovery during the Great Depression?
Absolutely. So President FDR was our longest serving president with 4 terms, famously helps us get out of the depths of the Great Depression and then World War II. But he was personally a very large proponent of blackface because he saw Stephen Foster music like Oh Susanna, Camptown Races, or songs like Dixie by Daniel Decatur Emmett as being patriotic. And that is very confusing for us today. But these were songs about longing for a home front, longing for a very romantic idea of the American past, in which there was a very clear gender and racial hierarchy. And so, in the throes of the Great Depression, one brilliant thing that the American government did was create the Works Progress Administration, which put millions of artists back to work, whether you were a director, composer, a historian, and give them federal funds to expand American entertainment and the arts. But one of the caveats was that it had to promote American culture. And so Roosevelt thought, what is more emblematic of American culture than blackface? Nothing. And the government really continues to toe this line until the civil rights movement, when the story really changes to jazz being the emblematic identifier globally of American entertainment. But what Roosevelt does is he goes and he buys up these 79 publishing houses, largely coming out of New York and Chicago, that were printing this sheet music and these how-to guides. And by doing that, they fall into public domain. And once they're in public domain, all of these songs became the DNA to American curriculum. This is part of the reason why every child in America can sing Oh Susanna all the way up through the 21st century. And it's because
Hmm.
of this critical moment of what FDR did.
Well, when you read about FDR, the how many biographies are there, and his love of minstrelsy is how you put it, it's not in there. When
Yes.
I mean, when did this erasure happen? Did it happen immediately? Did it happen over time?
It happens over time. So, one of the climaxes of the book is discussing a day in April. The anniversary was actually last Sunday of when Roosevelt died in 1945. April 1945, at the height of World War II. America was marching towards victory, but we weren't there yet, right? We still hadn't, unfortunately, dropped the bombs in Japan that will be absolutely cataclysmic. And FDR decides that the one thing that would raise his spirits is a minstrel show. And he is vacationing in Warm Springs, Georgia, at his polio rehabilitation center, where he was really on the cutting edge of medical research for polio as a survivor himself. And in an interesting sort of footnote of blackface history, the Jim Crow character, of which our legal system was named after, was not only represented in blackface, but also was a disabled character who was often portrayed as dragging his back foot and spinning around in an interesting, complex choreography. And getting a polio diagnosis was truly devastating
Mm.
in the mid 20th century. It would normally financially ruin a family, and the children were actually normally hidden. And so Roosevelt wanted a way for these children to be able to be in the public, to be able to perform on stage, and to be patriotic, and disturbingly decided that blackface performances was the way to do it. And so in this chapter, I explore how central blackface was throughout Roosevelt's life as a young man who went to Harvard, as a member of fraternal orders, as somebody who then oversaw the federal government during the Great Depression and World War II. But what's interesting and all the more complex is there's a famous photograph that announces Roosevelt's death globally. And it's a picture of a black Navy man playing an accordion, looking up to the heavens and crying. And his name was Graham Jackson. And this black performer was actually Roosevelt's personal entertainment hero. And he happened to be there the day of the minstrel show. So I also use it as a way to open the door into the very complex history of how many black performers themselves who wanted to be a part of entertainment as musical geniuses or comedic geniuses were forced by the Jim Crow era to also reckon with and engage in this total all-consuming cultural form, and what that really did to people's psychology to recognize that they could only be a celebrity or perform their art if they were willing to essentially debase themselves with this entertainment form.
Who fought against blackface?
This is the heart and soul of the book. So both Black civil rights workers, going all the way back to Frederick Douglass, had always been very vocal about why this was so violent and detrimental. But because of the federalization in the Great Depression and World War II, it is popping up in places that it had previously not been. And so you have what I call Black Rosie the Riveters, who were on the front lines of World War II. But then in the 1950s, after the Double Victory campaign, these are the exact same women who are integrating America's suburbs in New York and California. Their children, their baby boomer babies, are integrating American public schools. And they were horrified to discover that the first thing that their children were being asked to do was perform in these amateur blackface shows. And so I use a few major figures, one of them being Betty Reed Soskin, who unfortunately just passed in December at the very young age of 105, who is also our largest and uh, oldest serving national park ranger, retiring at the age of 100, who during World War II, the 1950s and the 1960s, co-owned a very important Black-owned record company and store in Berkeley, California, called Reed's Records. And she really becomes central to this movement of Black mothers who say, this is not acceptable. This does not represent who I am or what Black music is or Black art, and it sure as heck does not represent my child. And they fascinatingly use the remnants of World War II and the Nuremberg trials and the burgeoning human rights movement and legal developments in human rights law to essentially argue that what was happening domestically in the United States with these federally funded shows was akin to what happened in Weimar Germany against European Jews, and essentially saying this is a cultural hate crime that needs to be removed. And so then I followed the lives of these women, but also their children, who then, at the height of the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, Black beauty, women's rights, and also the Vietnam War, once again are confronted with these fraternities at major universities that continued to use this as a way to galvanize substantial amounts of money on college campuses and their more militant tactics to get these off of university campuses.
It's a fascinating book. It's called Darkology, Blackface and the American Way of Entertainment. I've been speaking with its writer, Ray Lynn Barnes. Thank you for sharing your research with us.
Thank you. Have a great day.